أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome all to this new session of Friday Talk. Can you confirm that you can hear me and you can see the slide?
Yes.
Shukran. Shukran, Sheikh Hafidh. Jazakumullah khair. Okay, the topic is Jihad and war in the Quran, and this is part 2. It's a continuation of the talk that I did a couple of weeks ago. Just for just to backtrack a little bit to refresh for those who attended the last session or for those who did not attend, we discussed in part 1 actually 4 points. First of all, we talk about the danger of taking sacred verses out of context, and this is how the Islamophobes, they have misinterpreted these war verses in the Quran, and they use to bash Islam and Muslims. And also the extremist groups like ISIS, they misuse these verses for their own agenda. We also discuss about the peaceful aspect of jihad as given in many different scenarios in the Quran and Hadith. So we concluded that jihad is not necessarily meant all the time military engagement. We also gave we discussed justification for military engagement when permission to fight was granted in the Quran after 13 years of peaceful struggle in Mecca, despite the violence and the suffering the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions endured in Mecca. And then we gave context for many of those war-related verses in the Quran, and in order to be able to interpret them correctly. So this is what we did in part 1. Now, overall, in part 1, the Quran, it provides a moral argument, in order to engage in a war defending oneself against injustice. And these verses are very clear, describing the permission was granted because they were wronged, they were driven out unjustly from their homes and properties, and they were coerced into disbelief. The Quran also provides a counterbalance argument for armed resistance to protect religion, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, if Allah does not repel some people by means of others, many monasteries and churches and synagogues and mosques where Allah's name is much invoked will have been destroyed. And therefore here there is a necessity to protect not only the buildings, the houses of worship, but to protect religion. And all religion is not, people, you should be free to practice their religion, not only Islam here. Overall, we have seen that when permission to fight, is not given just in the form of just go ahead and fight, but the Quran is very meticulous here. There is a justification, and there is a restriction or rules, and then reminders of Allah's power and the believer's duty, to Him, or to be accountable to Him. Also, those who have been given permission to defend themselves are reminded again and again to keep up the prayers, the fasting, to pay zakat, to adhere to the moral values, and to command what is right and to forbid what is wrong. So it's not like the Quran is, accused by others as being a book that promotes violence, and injustice. That's not correct, because this is very clear what we have done before. Now, the content for this part 2, will focus on the war principles and guidelines in Islam, And we will look into these conflicts between the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and 3 Jewish tribes of Medina, Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Nadir, Bani Qurayza. And if there is time, we will touch about diplomacy of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, inshallah. Why I want to touch these conflicts? Because much of misunderstanding, about an accusation of the Quran and the Prophet in general, that it promote violence is related, at least from the Western scholarship, is related to these incidents. If we just take a quick survey of how war is mentioned in the Quran, we will find it is distributed in these 5 areas. And interesting is if you look at number 4, rules of war, there are at least 11 verses that discuss about the rules of war, how to behave in a wartime. And this is something unique in Islam, because there was no any kind of rules of engagement or in a conflict in the previous civilization, whether a Greek or Roman civilization or Judeo-Christian civilization or even Eastern civilization. Maybe some of you have read the history when the Mongolians invaded Muslim lands, how destruction, there was no limits on the type of destruction they could do. And therefore Islam, it brings rules of law, rules of war. And these rules of war have actually shaped our modern world, because after the Second World War, when they started to make declaration of human rights and Geneva Convention, there were no references except what is provided by the Quran and the prophetic teaching in terms of how to engage in wars. Okay, so first of all, what does the Quran say about rules of war? So I'm just touching here quickly, and I will go point by point afterwards. So when war is justified, the Quran describes the principle and guidelines how to conduct these wars. So no aggression, for example, on the part of Muslim, since God loves not the aggression or doesn't like aggressors. The Quran describes who is to fight and who is exempted. And the Quran describes when hostilities must cease, how people should be treated. Response to violence and aggression must be proportional. Even when you are right, when it is justified for you to fight, but you should not go out of proportion. We have seen in the modern time, how wars, countries have conducted out of proportion wars against as a response to certain situations. Also, peaceful solutions to disputes are preferred to military ones. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ will exhaust all possibilities for peaceful solution before actually went into war. So, but when war is unavoidable, every opportunity to end the war also must be pursued. For example, if the enemy inclines towards peace, then you must also incline towards peace. We can see today, sometimes enemies already want peace, and people will go to torpedo any effort, to do peace. Totally disregard. So among the rules of war, and I'm going to enumerate 10 of them, the most important ones. So the first one is no war with those who want peace. So this is what I just said, and I'm quoting the verse from the Quran. Allah does not forbid you, for example, from those who have not made war against you on account of your religion and have not driven you forth from your homes, that you show them kindness and deal with them justly. All right? And you can see the other verse that say, "Oh, you who believe, when you go to war in Allah's way, make investigation and do not say to anyone who offers you peace, you are not a believer." Right? So there's a emphasis that, those who want to do peace, right, then you are also inclined to do the same. The other rule is war is the last resort. So Prophet Muhammad, as I said, Sallallahu he tried to resolve conflicts through diplomacy first, and evidence is the Prophet signed many treaties of peace with neighboring tribes. Okay, even with Christians of the world, he signed peace agreements. There's no record that also he dishonored or broke any of his treaties, which is quite common today. We see parties or governments, they sign treaties and then they break the treaties, or they sign treaties and then they don't have intention of actually keeping up with the conditions of the treaties. The Quran demands Muslims to honor their commitments in treaties and contracts. When the Prophet, for example, made the peace treaty of Hudaybiyah with Meccan polytheists, his companions protested as being unfair to Islam and Muslims. But the Quran described it as an open victory, and this shows the emphasis, on peace and conflict resolution, rather than to aggravate conflicts. The other rule is you need to be merciful towards enemy. The Prophet Muhammad did not crush his enemies physically or psychologically, even in warfare. When he conquered Mecca, he entered the city with his head down, and he gave amnesty to everyone. Even the Meccan polytheists did not expect, neither could they believe this pinnacle of act of magnanimity. When the news of Khalid bin Walid killing a few prisoners of war after a battle with a particular tribe reached the Prophet, he was very much devastated. He lifted his hands in the sky and said, "Oh Lord, I am far from what Khalid has done. I did not command him what he has done." All right, and this is shows how the purpose. All the wars that the Prophet Muhammad fought, the purpose, it was not to crush, and to harm, but the purpose was to bring people back to realization of the oneness and submission to God. There's a prohibition of torture. The Prophet Muhammad did not allow mistreatment and torture practices, of enemies, prisoners of war. And a good example is Suhail bin Amr was a poet and was captured as a prisoner of war during the Battle of Badr. Knowing that poets can be more damaging, these will be like the social media of today. Then the warriors, to set public opinion. Umar ibn Khattab, he suggested to the Prophet that Suhail's front teeth to be removed in order to render his destructive poetry ineffective. And the Prophet replied, "No, I cannot torture him. If I torture him, God will punish me. Besides, one day, perhaps he could say something you may like." So later on, Suhail, when he became a Muslim, he made a lot of good poetry. In comparison, torture, was the hallmark of the US perpetual war on terror, where many other countries were coerced to participate in clandestine acts to torture other human beings who were mostly innocent. Islam also prohibits mutilation of dead bodies. Islam has prohibited degrading or mutilating corpses of their enemies, and this was a common practice, by the way, in pre-Islamic Arabia during the Jahiliyyah. It has been said in a hadith, the Prophet has prohibited us from mutilating the corpses of the enemies. You can find this in Bukhari. And mutilation of corpses also was a common scenario in the US war on terror in Iraq and elsewhere. Not to attack non-combatants, civilians. When the Prophet was sending, an army to the north to meet Byzantine expedition, you're right, and he gave the following guidelines to the young Muslim commander, Osama. Only fight with aggressors. Fight only the ones who fight you. You should not fight with the people who are civilians. Do not breach your word. Keep up with your, if you make a commitment, keep up with your commitment. Do not cut down fruit-bearing trees. Even trees should not be cut. Only, you do a minimum destruction. Do not damage livestock. Even animals, you cannot kill animals unnecessarily. Only you can slaughter animal in the name of Allah for food, but you cannot just destroy animals. Do not kill women, do not kill children, do not kill monks who are withdrawn from the world and worship in monasteries. Do not wish to meet the enemy as well. It's not something that you brag about, meeting the enemy. You never know, you may be inflicted with a calamity as a result. So this is the kind of rules and principles that Islam has promoted when it comes to dealing with in wars. Act under legitimate authority only. It was very important to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that no one took the law in their own hands and acted on their own accord without decision of the central authority. So many of these groups and individuals who go around and do all sort of terrorist acts in the name of Islam, this would not be acceptable. They are putting more damage and harm to Islam than to actually help. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reproached one of his companions who happened to kill an enemy in the war after he had surrendered and uttered the testimony of faith, Shahada. And the companion, justified killing the man by saying that he uttered Shahada out of fear of death. And the Prophet responded, he said, did you tear his heart open in order to find out whether he said it out of belief or not? Right. So even in that situation, also you need to investigate intelligence before striking. Now, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was involved in few preemptive battles when he knew the enemy was planning a strike. But he also knew the risk in preemptive strike is that if the intelligence is wrong, the act of war will no longer be legitimate. And we all remember, when the war against Iraq was justified in the United Nations based on intelligence that was not correct. And therefore, the whole of that destruction was had no any legitimacy. The Prophet taught that intelligence need to be verified and confirmed. And we have some examples. The Prophet sent Walid ibn Uqba to Banu Mustalik tribe to collect zakat. And Walid, he thought Banu Mustalik, they were trying to kill him. And, this could have started a war at that time, but they didn't. Khalid ibn Walid was sent to confirm the news. And Khalid ibn Walid learned that the truth of the matter, it was not like they wanted to kill him or they wanted to be aggressive. And no further action was necessary after that. You have to avoid casualties and collateral damage. in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the lives of Muslims were not put to risk. According to the Quran, one of the reasons why the Prophet signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, as opposed to fighting the Meccan policies at that time, it was in order not to risk the lives of Muslims, especially those who are in Mecca still, who are not able to, to migrate to Medina. And this is documented actually in the Quran, because in this verse, Allah says, had there not been believing men and women whom you did not know, that you may have killed them, and on this account, a sin will have been committed by you without knowledge. And the last one is the one I want to cover today. There could be some more as well, but my research is limited to these 10 humanitarian aid to the enemy. During a drought in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he sent help. He sent money to purchase food, despite the animosity and violence exhibited by the Meccan policies toward the Prophet and his followers. So where some Meccan leaders, such as Umayyah ibn Khalaf, did not want to accept the aid, but others like Abu Sufyan accepted the aid in embarrassment. And we can see right now, with the earthquake devastation of Syria, the West is still insists on embargo on Syria. They have not eased it up to allow help to come to the people of Syria. Now, if you may wonder, if why all these rules, these rules of war. Well, these rules of war actually brought fruits, and the fruits of these rules you can see from the number of deaths in the wars that were fought by the Prophet. Okay, total, I quoted the last time about 400, because there were some other additional few deaths that took place outside the war, after the wars. But during the war, there were only 386 people who were killed from both sides, from Muslim and non-Muslim side, 183 Muslims and 203 non-Muslim. And in that, table is enumerated, for each war or for each major battle, in the Badr, in Uhud, in Trench, in Hunain. This low level of death, almost negligible by today's standard, because the war that is going on now, between Russia and Ukraine, already it has taken, more than 200,000 lives already, and more than 100,000 casualties already. And these are very destructive wars. These are not the wars that we could even imagine in the Prophet time, and during after the Prophet, during the Islamic civilization. So conflict with these particular 3 Jewish tribes, this is what I want to to cover now. And these tribes were living in Medina at the time of arrival of Islam in the 7th century. There was a considerable Jewish population in Hijaz, mostly around Medina, around Khaybar, and around Taymar. The Jews came to Hijaz after they fled Palestine in the 2nd century, when the Roman Emperor Hadrian expelled Jews from Judea. And those Jews that settled in Medina, composed of a dozen competing tribes, living as the clients of several Arab tribes. They were like sponsored or supported by several Arab tribes. And the leading ones were these 3, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza, who particularly had age relationship with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and whom he negotiated and he fought, and eventually he expelled them from Medina. But there were other Jewish tribes, and these are forgotten. Many people don't talk about the other Jewish tribes that didn't have any problem with the Prophet or with the Muslims, and they stayed in these areas even beyond the Prophet's death. So these Jewish tribes, you have the some of the names you can see by yourself. There were these other Jewish tribes that remain living in Medina and its suburbs after the Prophet's death. But the Jewish and the Orientalist sources, they tend to overlook this fact. They never mention about this fact. They talk about as if these three tribes were the only Jewish tribes, and they were driven out of Medina completely. So Medina was completely cleaned, from the Jews. And this is not true. These Jewish and Orientalist sources tend to generalize the isolated conflicts with those three particular Jewish tribes as the paradigm of prophets and Islam's attitudes towards Jews. As Medina political leader and arbiter of law, the Prophet's action against these three Jewish tribes was based on the common law that was negotiated in a legally binding civil treaty, which was called the Medina Constitution. So it was not like the Prophet acted arbitrarily out of hatred or something. Yeah, the treaty, the Medina Constitution. So this is the first thing that the Prophet did when he moved to Medina, because Mecca was monolithic in terms of there were only these Arab polytheists. But when he migrated to Medina, he found this multicultural environment. You have the Jews, you have Arabs from Aus or Khazraj, you have Muslims, people who already chose Islam. You also have some polytheists, you also have some Christians. And therefore, what the Prophet did is he made this Medina Constitution, and this is the first actually a document on a civil constitution in the history of mankind that we actually know about. So the treaty consists of 47 articles, and the complete text has been reproduced word by word or word for word by many Prophet biographers, including Ibn Ishaq. So this is the articles that I'm quoting are coming from from Ibn Ishaq, but you can find them from many other sources. The treaty deals with the formation of a sovereign city-state with a common citizenship consisting of Muslim, Jews, Christian, and polytheists. And it provided a federal political structure with a centralized authority, but at the same time, these different communities, they were given autonomy in area of social, cultural, and spiritual matters. So, for example, the Jews, they could, they had the autonomy in terms of organizing themselves socially, culturally, and, spiritually. The treaty established, you can say, the first pluralistic and multicultural society, even by modern standards, by granting equal rights and duties to the citizens. And these citizens are different groups. The articles of the treaty that are relevant for our discussion here, these articles 13, 15, 17 to 45, in particular, because they deal with the critical issues of national security and defense of the new city-state. And Article 23 and 41, it provides resolution in cases of disputes. Article 37 recommends Muslim and Jews, they must seek mutual advice and consultation. So, everything was well organized and well thought of. The Prophet Muhammad, he saw the potential of problems, and he wanted to have everything transparent, everything negotiated. Everyone knows, what is his duty, what is his responsibility, so that they could live peacefully. And Article 44 obliges the parties to the agreement to assist each other against any attack. And we're talking about a different world. We're talking a world, where in a way, maybe there is a resemblance today, because after 9/11, I remember very well George Bush, the junior, he was the president at that time, and he said, "You either with us or against us." This kind of dichotomy, right, which is kind of very strange. We can see it even today. The West is going everywhere to campaign against people dealing with Russians. So you either with us or against us. And to some extent, in the pre-modern time, you had these two abodes as well, Darul Islam and Darul Harb. So if you are either in peace or people are constantly in wars, and therefore this kind of agreement was something very unique, I think, very progressive at the time. Now, each community member signed and ratified the treaty, and they vow to fulfill all their obligations. Now, according to the Prophet biography of Ibn Ishaq, Bani Qaynuqa was the first Jewish tribe in Medina to violate the treaty by collaborating with Meccan polytheists against the Muslims. Now, this treaty, this treacherous action, because it's a treason, even by today's standard, it is a treason, and it revoked all the articles of the state's national security and defense in the treaty, in particular to these articles. And therefore, the Prophet's declaration of war against the Jewish tribe of Banu Qaynuqa was supported by his legal mandate as he had, and as it was defined in Article 23 and 41, that provide resolution in cases of disputes. Two verses were revealed that corroborate this episode, because we're not taking only what Ibn Ishaq is saying, all right? The Quran, this verse 300, Surah Al-Imran, verse 12, and the second verse gave the Prophet permission to fight against people who violate the treaty. This is 858. Now, soon after the Muslim army surrounded the fortress of Banu Qaynuqa, the siege continues for a while, and in time period, they surrendered with no casualties. The Prophet accepted the arbitration of Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was, I think, selected by the other party, where they were provided safe passage to leave Medina with all their belongings, including their arms. It is clear that the Prophet's motivation of the expansion of the Jewish tribe of Banu Qaynuqa in Medina was not religious or economic, as it has been portrayed in the West by many Jewish and Orientalist sources. Although this Jewish tribe, as well as the others like Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza, they showed open opposition to the Prophet, but he didn't have he didn't expel them because they were opposing Islam. It was a result of their violation of the civil rule, which they agreed upon, that resulted in their expulsion. And also the Quran supports this. The conflict with Banu Nadir, it originated with their refusal to take part in the Battle of Uhud, or at least to take a neutral position, not to support the Meccan polytheists. As per all the Prophet's biographers, the conflict, it grew worse when an attempt on the Prophet's life by Banu Nadir was thwarted. They actually wanted to kill the Prophet. Okay, they wanted to drop a stone from an upper building, where the Prophet was sitting, and he was alerted, by Angel Jibril alayhi salam, to move. Okay, So Banu Nadir's action violated articles of the Treaty on State Security and National Defense that left the Prophet with no option. And the Prophet asked Banu Nadir to leave Medina in 10 days or brace oneself for war. They refused and remained in their fortresses, and the Prophet and his army surrounded them and remained for 10 days until they surrendered, under the condition that they will leave Medina carrying whatever their belongings. And this account also is corroborated in the Quran. Okay, verse 59, Surah 59, verse 1 to 5. Now, operating outside Medina, Banu Nadir played a major role in uniting all the factions that were hostile to the Prophet to make a confederate or Ahzab. The plan was to form a large confederate army that was meant to overwhelm the city of Medina and exterminate Islam and Muslim once for all. And the Prophet decided to stay and fight in Medina and ordered the digging of trenches to shield the city, or Khandak. This battle, referred to the Battle of Khandak or Battle of Trench, was crucial and existential within the history of Prophet's struggle against the Meccan policies and their allies. Because if they lost this battle, it will have finished. Probably we will not have had Islam. So the Bani Qurayza's position in this battle was very crucial because they were living within the northeastern part of Medina. So any switch of alliance on their part to the enemy could change the end result of the battle, because the chain of this protection by the Khandak around Medina, this area where the Bani Qurayza were living, this would have been a back door for the enemies to come in. Now, because the trenches that demarcate the entire city of Medina well guarded the city, the battle lasted for the full month, during which there had been no severe engagements. There were only skirmishes. Now, Huyay ibn al-Akhtab, the leader of the Jewish tribe of Bani Nadir, he brokered a deal that persuaded Banu Qurayza to violate the treaty. The whole Confederate forces were planned to attack the Muslim army from the north and south simultaneously. When word of Bani Qurayza's renegade, that they changed their mind about the treaty they had, Medina's constitution, reached the Muslim camps, the Prophet sent a delegation to the Banu Qurayza to discuss the matters and reminded them of their obligation under the treaty. However, the response was not positive because they were almost sure that they were going to defeat the Prophet. Now, they had decided to side with the Confederation against the Muslims, and it is not difficult to imagine how this treachery act affected the morale of the Muslims, yet the Muslims, they won the battle. The Quran, Surah 33, it takes its name from the mention of the Confederates, Al-Ahzab, or the alliance among the Meccans and other tribes, including these Jewish tribes of Bani Qurayza, and Bani Nadir is included, who fought the battle of Al-Khandak, and you can make a reference, verse 9 to 27 of Surah Al-Ahzab to understand this episode. According to Ibn Ishaq, after the Muslim returned from the battlefield, before recovery, Archangel Gabriel, or Jibril alayhi salam, he came to the Prophet and delivered the message that Allah commanded him to fight the Bani Qurayza. The Prophet gathered his followers before even they settled down, and in no time they were at the Banu Qurayza's stronghold and instituted a siege that lasted 25 days. Now, Ibn Ishaq narrated two conflicting accounts. in one account, he said Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh was chosen by Bani Qurayza to arbitrate, and all parties agreed to this judgment. Now, Sa'ad's verdict was the men to be killed, their property to be divided, and the women and children to be taken as slaves, as per the Jewish law. And you know, there's a claim that Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, he used the Old Testament, you know, reference to make his verdict. It was reported that, you know, between 600 and 900 men of Bani Qurayza were executed. Most of the, you know, the references that you can read, you know, and this is something, it appears to be astonishing, you know, this number, large number of people to have been killed, because this number by that time, the standard is unimaginable, because the whole of the battles that the Prophet fought, they didn't come even half of this number. So Ibn Ishaq account unfortunately is a single source on these numbers. No other independent historian reported this episode. And all those who quoted, they quoted Ibn Ishaq. So anyone who quoted this figure, any historian, it will be quoted, you know, re-quoted from Ibn Ishaq's account, because there's no any original independent source to tell us about these numbers. Now, Ibn Ishaq accounts of Bani Qurayza's siege doesn't make a lot of sense for seven reasons. First of all, the verse in the Quran, you know, if you look at Surah Al-Ahzab, you know, and if you look at, you know, all these verses, 9 to 10, 26 and 27, it refers to the Prophet's siege of Bani Qurayza's, very brief. There is no mention of the killing of a large number of men. You know, there is a mention of killing, and there's a mention of, you know, of people who have been taken as captive, but there was no mention of this large number of killing that, you know, that Ibn Ishaq referred. Now, the account of Ibn Ishaq contradicts the Quranic verse, since there was a revelation that has judged the matter and the Prophet had to abide. There was no need for the Prophet to offer his own judgment or to pursue arbitration through Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. This is also a contradiction, because here, you know, the Prophet has got wahi, very clear-cut instructions what to do. Why does he need to put his own judgment or to you know, to ask arbitration? So this is also a contradictory. Another contradiction is the legal rule that is in line with the Quran is not to punish, is to punish only people who commit the crime. Thus, an execution of all Bani Qurayza's men would have been in direct violation of the Quran by punishing the innocents and transgressing the rights of prisoners of war. What will be reasonable conclusion is few persons they were executed because they led the sedition. So no reason is found to account for why the Banu Qurayza will be treated differently from the other two Jewish tribes who were allowed safe passage to leave Medina. This is another, you know, contradiction. If indeed many people had actually been executed within the marketplace, and this would have been something very abnormal in that time. So the trenches, you know, there must have been dug for mass grave. It is unusual that no historian has ever recorded the site position or provide any kind of reference or any kind of visual mark. And had the killing actually occurred, legal jurists would have adopted it as a precedent. But in reality, exactly the opposite has been the case. Muslim jurists have always dispensed their legal rulings in accordance to the Quranic code. No bearer of burden will bear the burden of another. وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. This is this is a bedrock of distributing or delivering justice in the Quran. Many places this has been referenced. Historians of the Prophet, and this is the last point, historians of the Prophet's biographies, including Ibn Ishaq, haven't followed the strict rules of narrations as applied in Hadith sciences. So, this quotation, Ibn Ishaq must have quoted someone without really the need to see the unbroken chain of narrators, like the way we have in Hadith, in recording or narration of the Sunnah. Okay, so this concludes, these three, the conflict that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had with these three Jewish tribes, which are misrepresented in the Western literature as if the Prophet was had something against the Jews, and he hated Jews, or Islam is, is against Jews, or something of that sort. There was an agreement. Okay, this is the Constitution of Medina, and it was important agreement to have all these different groups who practice different faith and different culture to be able to come to live together. And the Prophet's intention was to have the tolerance, tasamuh, and coexistence, ta'ayush, between them. And these three tribes did not fit in, because they will not actually be tolerant and be able to coexist with others peacefully. In conclusion, reading from the various sources about the conflicts that developed between the Prophet and the three Jewish tribes of Medina, it's clear that the Prophet had always an open mind and positive attitudes regarding their Jewish communities, those Jewish communities in Medina, and wanted to work with them as one ummah or one nation. The Quran is critical about particular Jews and their behavior, but by no means should that be generalized for all Jews, as much as the Quran is critical about some Christians and some Muslims as well. So it's not because the Quran is a book of guidance. So misbehaviors of any community, the Quran points out in order to let people learn, these are things that need to be corrected. Now, the expulsion and punishment of those three Jewish tribes was the direct result of their violations of the treaty in the matters of state security and national defense that they themselves negotiated and signed. And it wasn't an arbitrary decision on the part of the Prophet, as has been portrayed by some Jewish and Orientalist sources. The Prophet wasn't acting out of own hatred of the Jews, but was acting on the common law that was previously agreed upon by all communities who signed and ratified the Medina Constitution, and on God's commands as reference within the specific verses in the Quran. Most Jewish and Orientalist sources, they view the events in the Prophet's life from secular angle only, as they look at it as a political motivated, instead of seeing them in light of their religious significance. Besides, the Prophet did not act on his own without being divinely guided. Finally, if the acts of treason of these three Jewish tribes were to be judged as per any known law to humanity, whether it's ancient or it's contemporary, whether it's sacred or it's secular, it will still impose severe penalty against them after breaking the treaty and allied with the enemy. Okay, so this is the conclusion. I still have 10 minutes, and I will run through quickly diplomacy of the Prophet Muhammad. Unless if there's any specific question, I'll be very happy to attend a question. Okay, if there's no question, I will continue. So let's look at the diplomacy of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There is ample evidence that the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he tried to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and through signing peace treaties. He signed many peace treaties with neighboring Arab tribes and with the Christians of the world. There is no record of the Prophet dishonoring his peace treaties, as we said, and to ensure peace, he even signed disadvantageous treaties like the one that was signed in Hudaybiyah. Perhaps as an unparalleled triumph in history, the Prophet, he pulled off a diplomatic victory by capturing the city of Mecca peacefully, without a battle or spill of blood. So he gave a general amnesty for the people of Mecca, even though these were same people who persecuted, who attacked, and intended to annihilate the Prophet and his followers for 20 years. I recommend these two books. You can find some Western intellectual who sometimes, who will be fair and present the Prophet properly. One called, he wrote like a biography of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and his title is "A Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires." You need to understand the context when the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he lived his time when these big, you could say superpowers of that time, the Byzantium and the Sassanid, they were in continuous perpetual wars. And he found himself in between, and he was able to pursue peace. And one call, I think he presented very well. It's not an easy book, but it will take you, it's kind of original work. And the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. This is another very interesting book. And if you look at the text of of these agreements that the Prophet is signed with these Christians, it amazes me to see these days some people will accuse of Islam being especially with the Christians, being anti-Christian or anti-Christ, or this kind of talk. I want to just to highlight the importance of these three documents, pre-modern documents: the Madinah Constitution, also the Prophet's farewell sermon, Khutbat al-Wada of the Prophet, and these covenants of the Prophet that he signed with the Christians of the world. These are very important historical documents or narrations on basic human rights. Those involved in drafting the contemporary Human Rights Charter and the Geneva Convention must have been inspired by these, because there was nothing before this. All right, there was nothing before these documents, because those documents preceded the British Magna Carta of by 5 centuries, and the American Bill of Rights by 10th century, when the concept of human rights did not materialize in both Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian traditions. The content of these important historical documents on basic human rights in Islam are not existing in solidarity, but they are well grounded actually on Islamic teachings that are corroborated by the Quran. Because these are some of the basic human rights teachings in the Quran, on the sacredness of human life, on the right to basic necessities of life, on liberty, on equality of human beings, on the rights to justice and fairness, on protection of honor and dignity and privacy, on freedom of expression and speaking out what is right and just. You know, all these rights, basic human rights, are well covered in the Quran and very explicit. The Prophet himself, he embodied these Quranic principles on basic human rights in the way he led his life, in the way he governed his people, and in the way he dealt with others, and the way he fought his enemies as well. In contrast, those nations involved in the drafting of the UN Human Rights Charter and UN Geneva Convention, they were committing atrocities of their own as they were drafting those charters. And they continue to commit atrocities even today. Example, how many Muslim countries were unjustly invaded and destroyed in the last 2 decades? Hundreds of thousands, innocent people were killed, injured, tortured, dehumanized, and displaced with disregard of their basic human rights. And the UN Human Rights Charter and UN Geneva Convention are merely declarations, but have no force of law to affect horrors suffered by victims and to account, actually, especially those big powers who, kind of hiding behind these declarations. So this concludes my talk today. Let me stop sharing.